Welcome, Raph, to Game Thinking Live.
My name is Raph Koster, and I'm a game designer. And these days I'm working as a consultant, actually, helping out of lots of different teams and companies make better products. And most of them are games, but not all of them.
Awesome. We'll hear more about that in a moment. So at this year's Game Developer Conference, you gave a really powerful and interesting talk about lessons learned in years of doing online gaming. Can you give us a quick history of where you learned those amazing lessons that you can share about what works and what doesn't work in online social environments? How did you get started in that?
I got started, probably you would count it back to 1993. That's when I first started working in text-based online worlds, MUDs as they were called. So I've been doing it for over 25 years now. Our campus in college was actually one of the first Apple networked campuses even before that. So I've been hanging out online since the BBS days in the 80s, actually.
What are some of the seminal projects you worked on? Obviously, we worked together on Ultima Online.
Yes. That was one. That came out back in 1997. It's been a while. Before that, I did work on the text MUDs, and there were a couple of things that came out of that have had some resonance. The Laws of Online World Design, which was a collection of aphorisms and lessons that is still used today, and the Declaration of the Rights of Players, which also sadly still resonates a lot today and is in a lot of legal textbooks. I went on to be Chief Creative Officer at Sony Online. I worked on Star Wars Galaxies. I did my own startup called MetaPlace that was acquired. I ended up as a vice president at Disney. And I was there for a few years until going independent once again about 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years now.
So you also wrote a seminal book on game design that really opens up game design to a much wider group of people building products called A Theory of Fun. Talk about the origin story of that book. How did that come about and what motivated you to write and share with all of us that amazing thought process?
The original thoughts in the book were from discussions that I was having with fellow game designers, such as Noah Falstein and Dave Rickey. But the motivation for writing the book was that I had been working at that point on Star Wars Galaxies, and then after that as Chief Creative Officer, where I didn't have direct contact with the games I was making. I was no longer really hands-on. And when Galaxies came out, people said, hey, this is a great game, but also this part isn't very fun. And it made me want to go back and think about what fun is and get back in touch with kind of the core of making games. And so I actually started making small games, puzzle games, arcade games, action games on the weekends. I would design them on a Friday and code them on Saturday and put music and art on them on Sunday and bring them into work on Monday for people to try. And it was kind of a boot camp. And at the same time, I started reading a lot about cognitive science, evolutionary psychology, sociology, anthropology, and it all kind of just came together and became A Theory of Fun.
What was the most surprising thing that became clear to you when you were writing that book that wasn't clear to you when you started writing it?
How much games are about learning? How much of game design is about teaching, but in a particular way, teaching in a way that players internalize things, and there's numerous different terms for this in psychology. I like chunking because it's a chunky, fun word, but cognitive schema, habit, all of these are entrainment. There are many different terms for very similar processes. That was probably the most startling thing. I had grown very used to thinking of games as being systems, working as a game systems designer, but I hadn't really deeply thought before about the way in which games in a way are almost like a language. The systems are a language, and they have to teach themselves to you as you go and move you up on kind of a mastery path until at the end, you will have learned something. You won't necessarily know that you've learned something. You won't be able to explain it, probably, right? Because you're going to have learned it in an intuitive, understanding way. I use the word grok out of Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land, because it's a word that fits. And that to me was opened doors for me in terms of thinking about how games work, that were new doors and allowed me to connect it to these other disciplines and fields.
That opened doors for me too as a game and product designer. And when I've taught game design and assigned your book, it's always a huge light bulb moment. And I've very much incorporated the learning architecture aspects of games into game thinking in my own work. So one of the key things about games that's so good for learning is the ability to fail and learn from them. Your book was seminal learning for me and for my students. Big light bulb moment. Very much incorporate and embrace that position of fun is another word for learning. And that learning architecture is very much what game designers do, as well as what educators do. What have you learned from trying and failing and then reflecting in some of your own projects? Can you tell us about something you've worked on personally where that's a big part of how you actually end up reaching success?
You know, I tend to focus more on the failures where I keep trying and don't necessarily feel like I've succeeded yet.
Well, that's valuable too. But yeah, so like just give us a glimpse into your process.
I mean, some of the things that are almost windmills that I keep tilting at, of course, in online societies, I keep tilting at the idea of, can we get to a point where online communities can be self-governing and take care of themselves without it spiraling out into either of the two directions of an all-controlling operator who basically runs a quasi-fascist kind of environment, or on the other end, just rampant player killing and trolling and bad behavior. And I don't know that that one's solved, but there's been so many small lessons learned along the way. But that might not be a great example for your purposes. You know, creatively, when I think about something like this, an example that leaps to mind is I've wanted to make a small game about the sensation of a kaleidoscope for a really long time. And that seems like it ought to be something relatively small and easy to do. But I've actually been making games around that theme now for at least 15 years, trying to solve that particular problem. And I've approached it in a bunch of different ways. When I started out, I said, I want to make a game about a kaleidoscope. So I'm going to make a game that is radial and involves reflection. And that turned out to be very hard for players to wrap their head around. Then I said, what if I go with kind of the circular quality? And I've done a bunch of them that used circular mechanics in that way. And I keep trying to capture that feeling, and I still haven't managed it. But just about all of the games that I tried have been good games, right? They were all successes in my mind. So yeah, I think to me the fun thing about failure is, as long as you give each try a real try, right? Each iteration a real try, it might not solve the problem you were looking for, but it may very well end up solving a different problem, which can be something engaging and fun and interesting and a learning experience. And on top of that, there's always more to work at. There's always another mountain to climb. So I often say that making games is my favorite game, because I always feel like I'm learning something new every time I try doing it.
That's fantastic. You have a term that you've used that I've really adopted, which is a learning loop. And we're really talking about two different kinds of learning loops here. One is the learning loop that the player goes through as they do an activity and then get better at it and do something more interesting, which is the essence of a good game. But there's this other learning loop that the developer goes through, which is very much where game design and lean startup overlap, where the emphasis is on running small experiments that are high learning and then moving forward from there. So can you talk a little bit about how you see that in your own game development process, your own creative process?
I actually think those are the same learning loop. I think that when a player comes to a problem in a game, they also run small experiments and give things a try. And because the game allows them to fail without an enormous amount of consequence, they feel free to try stuff, give it a shot, and keep working on the problem. I try to approach my design in the same way. Generally speaking, if I'm working on something for myself, nobody has given me a problem. So I try to create problem sets for myself. Think of them almost as levels in a game. I try to give myself small game problems that are game design problems. And then I play with the process of solving them. One of the ways in which I do that is I often prototype using analog materials. So I literally pretty much bought out the wood craft aisle at the craft store. I have all these wooden cubes and circles and stars and rods and dowels and all kinds of things. And I have them all arranged in these chests and bins. And I will literally give myself the problem of grabbing 3 random things and saying, here's 3 kinds of things. Let's try making a game out of that. And I will sit at the table and play with them until some kind of system begins to emerge. The learning loop is very similar between the two. I try to approach all of these as, oh, here's a new problem. And once I figure out, my problem is coming up with a system that creates problems. That's the game designer's problem to solve. How do I create a system that offers interesting problems to a player? So I try to play that game of coming up with that system. And then once I have it, I try to create the learning loop for the player so that they can come to understand that system through play as well.
I love it. Crafting as emergent system design. So let's talk about feedback. So it's essential, of course, for every game designer and product designer to involve their players or their users in the creative process. And one of the things that often is tricky for people to manage is how you do that over time. How you start that, how you get your first few playtesters for your new rough idea that might be dowels and stars. And then as you develop that, how you get a different kind of playtester for a more developed game. How do you think about that process?
Well, I think feedback from users is an incredibly interesting problem, actually, because if you walk through it in almost stages, if you start even early at the concept stage, sometimes you're creating a concept for yourself, right? Like sometimes if I sit down to write a poem, I'm probably doing it for me, right? So sometimes you start from a genesis where there isn't really an external customer. But very often you're starting from a point where there is an external customer. And so the very first possible place where feedback can come in is actually almost in evaluating what the needs are, right? Who's out there who wants something like this? What is it that they want? Find the needs first and try to shape towards them. That's actually the very first point at which feedback kind of enters the picture. And so that one is very situation dependent, right? If you're creating something for yourself, creating something for monetary purposes, you want to see if there's an audience. If you're creating something for a client, then obviously the needs are predetermined and you have to find out what they are. That's the first place. Then you have the early iterating where you are trying out ideas and playing with them. I personally find it very valuable to not have feedback at that stage, to play kind of unfettered for a little while so that I can get a good feel for the landscape. But it isn't for very long. I tend to try to incorporate player feedback in really early. If I'm working on a tabletop project or even one of those little digital puzzle games, I often try to get people involved who aren't me, who can bring a fresh perspective somewhere in the range to, usually it's within a couple of days of having ideated. So it's pretty early for me.
And then what are you looking for in those really early playtests?
In the really early ones, I don't expect to have a learning loop. I don't expect people to be able to ramp into the game, right? Because usually what's there, if I use an analogy like a car, let's say, I will have designed a combustion engine and I will probably gas and brakes and some way to steer, but I will not have a car dashboard and a chassis and, so it does not look like a car at that point. It doesn't drive like a car. There isn't a wheel they can grab. So I don't expect them to really be able to give any feedback about how easily they understand things. Instead, what I'm looking for is feedback about whether or not the engine makes sense, whether or not the engine works. Even there, it's important to be careful about who you show it to. Some people have a natural predisposition to thinking about engines, and some people are very much dashboard people. And depending stage of the project, it's important to, you can show it to both kinds of people, but be aware where they're coming from. People who are dashboard focused will probably not give you great feedback on the engine part at first. And interestingly, people who are too engine focused will also often give you bad feedback early on, because they will want the most amazing engine because they don't care about dashboards. And so sometimes they will ask for the system to get more complex because they are only thinking about how cool an engine can be built, and let's add more cylinders and more doohickeys in there, right? And so you really have to weigh the feedback versus kind of the intent. I ran into this, to get super concrete. I was making a family card game, and I showed it to a bunch of friends of mine who were very avid board gamers and avid board game designers. And the feedback I got was accurate, but it was slanted towards a very core gamer rather than a family card game player. And so they were right that what I had shown them was too simple, but their advice was wrong. So they diagnosed the problem correctly, but they gave me advice either to make it radically more complex or to give up on it, when the answer was actually make it a little bit more complex and then go find people who want family party games, because that's actually who the game was intended for.
That's a great story. This reminds me of the issues we struggled with together, Ultima Online. And that was an interesting situation, because part of what you're talking about here is how important it is to find the right early customers to test on. It's actually really important. And Ultima Online did a great job of that because of the fan base of Richard Garriott. So the beta test group and those early power users, the dev team was really in touch with them, and they were giving great feedback, and it was a very dynamic and successful collaboration. And then when the game launched, we really had this struggle with the old guard and all the new people coming in and all their different needs, and how the core systems would support those needs, etc. So I've learned a lot since then. You've learned a lot since then, but we both learned a lot from that situation. So what was that like for you? What did you learn from that, and how have you carried that over into how you now manage these kinds of issues with your clients and with your own games?
Certainly, figuring out what the core product is about is kind of, for me, the core vision mantra now. I mean, both of us spend a lot of time working with companies in early stages, right? And early on in projects, it's interesting because we've actually had overlapping clients at times, and we actually do somewhat different things with them, right? The big thing that I tend to focus on a lot is on arriving at kind of vision. What is this about? For games in particular, I actually distilled it down to just 4 questions that I ask the team over and over again to force them to think about the core issues. I ask them, what basically is kind of the experience about? And I actually tell them, think about this like you're writing one of those dreaded English term papers in high school, right? I need to hear your thesis statement about what this book is about. The moral of the story, the thing that, the thing you're supposed to take away is your life lesson. And I ask them to tell me what that is from an experience point of view. I ask them to throw away everything they know about the systems, the underlying rules, whatever it is, and just tell me what that takeaway moral lesson is supposed to be, right? And then the next thing I ask is, great, you've told me what you want this to be about. Like, maybe it's about connection. Maybe it's about empowerment. Maybe, it's usually a nice, we try to get to a 1-sentence thing. And then I ask them, okay, put that completely on hold and talk to me about just the math. Talk to me about the rules, the structures, and in one sentence, tell me what this is about. Like the things a player or a user does, what numbers go up, numbers go down, lists get built. So, if in a classic heroic Lord of the Rings style role-playing game, the first question is usually something like save the world or, rescue the hostages or whatever. And the second question is something along the lines of repeatedly pop bags of XP to acquire more ability to pop larger bags of XP, of experience points, right? So it's about power loop usually in those. And so then I'll ask them the next two questions. How does the player do this in the story, right? Oh, they become more powerful by acquiring new spells or whatever. And then I'll ask them, how does the player do this in the mechanics? And walking through those four questions, and we do it for hours, right? It takes about half a day to really drill down on those questions, because it's easy to do with some projects and it's very difficult to do with others. Sometimes the fantasy is, I remember one project we worked on at Disney was a Facebook game called City Girl. And the core fantasy was that girl from a small town moves to the big city. What is that fantasy? What is that experience? What is it the player learns? How do they advance through that experience? Asking those questions was challenging. It's a difficult set of questions to answer. But at the end of it, what we end up finding is that the filters it creates on what should be in and out of the project are incredibly powerful, right?
MVP, baby. That's one of those ways you actually, on the ground, on the front lines, figure out what your MVP should be, is getting that specific.
It has to be last because one of the problems, and this is actually endemic in the game industry, is people starting with mechanics first. Oh, we need to make a shooter, right? And then they try to kind of paint over it with whatever their thematic intent is. And the thing is, if you say it doesn't work. If you have a shooter, you've already constrained your set of possible themes to this big. And you really need to think about what is it that you're trying to put out there in the world? What is it that you want the users to go through as an experience? It's okay if you think about it. You can think about projects starting at a mechanical end. That's an okay thing to do if what you're trying to put out there is a mechanical experience, if that makes sense, right? So Tetris is a canonical example. Tetris starts from a mechanical experience point of view. That's fine. You can start from either end of that, but you really need to think about what it is that you're trying to get across before you design rule sets.
What the journey is.
Yes.
Because the essence of what you're talking about is think through your player's journey to mastery. And the thing that connects it to product for me, but it's also true of games, is ask yourself, what is my customer learning and getting better at in the real world? Slack doesn't work because of all the mechanics. Slack works because it makes you better at getting work done with your team.
Yes.
And it makes you better at that.
A good way to think of it for me is there are a lot of things people can get better at. Sometimes it's very practical, mechanical, so if we're building a product that is, let's say, for training somebody in a manual skill, let's say, right? Flying an airplane, something like that. It's completely appropriate to say, this is a journey about mastering controls. That's perfectly fine. And we can think of that as being mechanical. It's also perfectly fine to say, we want people to go through an experience that teaches them about the importance of other humans on the planet, or about how it's critical that we be good stewards of our environment, or how it's a good idea to think about, to come to know yourself, right? And these are much more thematic and experiential kinds of things, but they're also patterns to learn. right? And so either way, we're teaching people patterns that we want them to internalize. So then really the step after that, the design process, is we have this pattern as an objective. It might be very crunchy and concrete. It might be very abstract and thematic. Either way, there is a journey to go on, and we need to build a structure that helps people get to that place to a degree at their own pace, right? They have to be able to try, fail, succeed, learn, and internalize it as they go.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be continuing this conversation in just a few days at Game Thinking Live. And it's always inspiring and illuminating to talk with you.
Oh, thank you. Always a pleasure.
All right. We'll talk soon.
All righty. Bye.